Hi, everyone. Welcome to our next panel, Social Media, National Security Risk, or a Tool for Democracy. My name is Teddy Wilhite, and I'm the Global Civic Partnerships Associate Manager for Facebook, and the moderator of today's discussion. I don't think I need to tell anyone joining us today via Zoom the importance of technology in today's world. As we live in a very tumultuous time, our communities, our relationships, and even our democracies have now moved online. We've got a great panel today to discuss the risks, the opportunities, and the challenges that has brought. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce MP Tamara Adrian, a member of Parliament for the National Assembly of Venezuela, Jack Harrison-Quintana, former Vice President for Social Impact and former Executive Director, Grinder for Equality, and Allie, Senior Research Analyst of Technology and Democracy at Freedom House. Thank you all for joining us today. With that, I'd love to actually start today's panel by giving each of you the floor to talk a little bit about your work and your thoughts on this topic. And MP Adrian, we'll start with you.
Thank you very much. I will start by saying that the environment we are living in Venezuela, it's a very different environment that you live in the United States or in most of the world. We have now, and we have had it for the past 10 years, the deepest collapse of an economy in the entire world in times of peace. The size of our economy, it's only about 10% of it used to be 10 years ago. In this context, we have the following risks. On the one hand, the dictatorship is controlling every media, particularly TV, radio, and all the newspapers. And the only way for politicians to actually be involved into politics and try to reach your audience and your constituents, it's via social media. And the other problem is that in Venezuela, less and less people have now access to internet, either because the official company that provides for services, the state-owned company that provides for internet services is working, is collapsing, basically. And the connectivity is very poor. And when you're able to have a private connection, it's not so good as it might be seen from my image. Sometimes it might froze. And that's one problem. The second problem is that as a consequence of the crisis, many people have lost their ability to have a smartphone because the one they had, it's broken or out of order, or simply because it's too old and it's not upgradable, and it's most of the new apps do not function in these smartphones. So less and less people are now able to connect via smartphones. We estimate that now it is barely around 62% of all the population that actually has access to a smartphone that it's able to connect reasonably to internet. This is a very challenging environment. And when you try to reach your audience, you have an additional problem that I've been feeling in the past 2 or 3 years. It's artificial intelligence, because your target, it's people that are not favorable to you, but might be people that are undecided. That's your main target in order to convince these people. But because of the algorithm of AI, now sometimes you are only heard and you are only reaching the people that are actually convinced, those who are in your favor, and that will not create additional possibilities for voting and additional possibilities for creating this new majority of people voting in favor of equality. So I might cut here because I know that I only have 3 minutes for this initial statement, but I think I might have given you a quite precise approach to what is happening in my country.
Thank you for those opening remarks. Jack, if you'd like to share your thoughts and ideas.
Sure. Thank you, Teddy. And thank you to Victory for having us and hosting this conversation. I've been in so many conversations like this that are not really centered on our community. So it's very cool to sort of be able to have the conversation in this context. You know, my story is really not of someone who intended to get involved in the technology sector. I really come from a background where I had been doing global LGBT activist work for many years. And then when I was hired at Grindr, I was basically thrust into this very question that is the title of our session today, which is, you know, can we make social media into something that's good for democracy and not only something that contains risk? And after, you know, almost 6 years of really being in this question, my biggest picture, kind of most zoomed out take on what has happened to us since the invention of the internet, and I think sort of with increasing speed now, is that it's just really raised the stakes on what has been a really long-term human problem, which is how do we figure out how to work collaboratively with each other across lines of difference and across the globe to make everyone's life better. And when we were able to contact each other, you know, more easily, it just made the scale go way, way up on that problem. And I think that what I see, and maybe this is a little bit of a hopeful frame, but that is kind of what I'm bringing, is that we are just really in the process of learning how to do this. And when I think about sort of what I did at Grindr, I think and I hope that it is kind of a score on the side of how can this be used for democracy? How can this be used for human rights? Because what we did really was incredible in the scale of collaboration. You know, sort of foundationally, what I set up at Grindr was a way for individual LGBTQ advocacy organizations or direct service organizations in all corners of the globe would be able to work with us in order to have access to the users of Grindr in their local area and make sure that they could connect with the folks who may need their services or who could get involved in that local movement. And there's so many examples I can cite, but because we're really zooming in on this word democracy, and also because we're here being hosted by the Victory Institute, I thought that I would just bring forward sort of one really quick example, which was work that I did with Victory in Colombia initially. We've also done it in Peru and a couple of other countries together, where when major elections were coming up, we worked with a number of stakeholders inside and outside the country to develop a voter guide for LGBTQ people that highlighted the LGBTQ people who are running for office at all levels around the country, and also what the public statements had been from the various political parties, you know, whether about sort of sexual orientation and gender identity issues, regardless of whether those were top of mind in their external communications. And the outcome of that campaign initially in Colombia was that we, in one election, tripled the number of out LGBTQ elected officials in the country. So, for me, that was just a very powerful example of how we can make it good for democracy. And, it is going to take a lot of work.
Oh, excellent. Well, I hope we can steer a lot of today's conversation into thinking about ways to make it good for democracy, because it is so important. And I think that's an excellent segue to our last panelist, Allie Funk.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for having me. I'm quite honored to be on this panel today. So through my job at Freedom House, I run our Freedom on the Net project, which is our global study of internet freedom. And we've been doing this since 2009. So I thought I would take this opportunity to really give a global perspective about some of the opportunities and the risks to social media that we've seen through our research. Around the world, there's just been a really a shrinking of the offline space for civic activism, and it's been just shrinking at an alarming pace, which has pushed people online to really do activism and to express themselves and to experience their human rights. So digital platforms now have just become a necessary part of everybody's day, especially amid the pandemic, whether it's to communicate with loved ones or express religious views or organize for political change. And some of the big examples, I think, of the really positive cases and opportunities for social media. I want to zoom in on Belarus, where Telegram and crowdfunding tools were fundamental not only during the recent protests after the unfree election that happened in August, but also as a way to raise money for and deliver medical resources to hospitals during COVID-19. So Telegram and crowdfunding really fundamental for people's public health. And then looking at Kenya, especially with Victory's mission here. People organized on Facebook and Twitter during a court case that was challenging the country's criminalization of same-sex marriage. So there's a lot of really great examples around the world about how these platforms and how the internet has been really used as spaces for human rights. But I mean, as we're going to talk about, of course, just as platforms have increased civic space, their proliferation globally has created an opportunity for a massive rise in surveillance and disinformation and censorship. So social media surveillance is really contributing to a global decline and global crackdown on human rights. We've seen record numbers of arrests, prosecutions, targeted harassments against people for their speech online. And it's really occurring across the democratic spectrum. It also undermines people's ability to simply organize and mobilize. And I think I'm based in the US. So, an example that I think a lot about is how in the US, the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security monitor social media platforms during the Black Lives Matter protest, with agents even showing up at people's houses to question them about their activity on Facebook. And then I think it also, there's this government element of it, which Freedom House focuses on. But there's also a company element of it as well, where companies can be complicit or forced to participate in governments' efforts to surveil their own citizens and distribute dangerous propaganda. And then governments, or companies, also can deploy these opaque algorithms and can access their users' intimate information for their own personal gain. And then I'd also just, before I close out, I know I'm running up on time, I want to note it's really important in our conversation to recognize that people have different risk models online and that not all social media apps are created equal. So the risks of using social media depend on who the user is, where they're located, and what app they're using. So a member of the LGBTQ community in Uganda, for example, may face a higher risk of digital repression when using Facebook than someone in Argentina, because Argentina's government might have stronger rights respecting legal system. And then I'm sure we'll get into this too, but Chinese apps, for example, like WeChat, are really subject to the country's draconian censorship and surveillance laws that other platforms might not be. So where do we go from here? That's the question I'm excited to dive into. How do we strengthen transparency, accountability? How do we ensure social media can be used for connection right now, but also protecting national security and privacy? And how we sort of answer these questions and how we craft how to move forward in this digital age is really of the utmost importance for the future of democracy.
Well, thank you for those thoughts, and what a way to kind of open today's discussion. I'm really struck by how many people spoke about connection and the importance of coalition building and organizing, and the principles of how that's all shifted online. As we think about risks and openness for the internet, I think maybe it'd be best to start by grounding the conversation in some in kind of the real lived experience of a more repressive media environment. like the one in Venezuela. And I was hoping, MP Adrian, if you could talk a little bit about how you engage in coalition building, how you engage online in a space that is increasingly closing for free expression and for organization in Venezuela.
Thank you very much for that question. I think it's of the core of this discussion here in this panel. And yes, the situation is very different in different environments. It's not the same in Venezuela or Cuba or China than to be, I don't know, in Mexico, or to be in the United States, or to be in Spain. And it really depends of how can you organize a real campaign, a campaign for impact that would allow, for instance, people to organize and people to change their hearts and their minds. From the political point of view, also it represents so many challenges that they are so many that to note that probably I will center myself in the fact that the only way you have in general to reach your audience, it's via social media, because you are forbidden to make to any presentation in the TV or in the radios. Last week, 2 weeks ago, I was interviewed for the first time in an open radio in about 2 years. And it was because it was the International the Day of Trans Visibility. And it didn't have to do anything about political matter, but about trans visibility. Of course, I try to push a little bit the interview in order to make another. But I was expressly asked before the interview to not to mention certain terms such as dictatorship, so as regime, such as de facto government, and things like that, because that would create a risk for the radio to be closed. And then you see that the only window we have in order to make a campaign, both for voting and also for a general campaign in favor of LGBTI rights, because let's remember that Venezuela is one of the few countries in America where now you don't have, in the Americas, where you don't have now any kind of rights, any kind of equal rights. You now have equal marriage and legal recognition of trans identities and protection against discrimination in Mexico, Costa Rica, Colombia, Ecuador, Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, and somehow in Bolivia. So that means that most of the countries of the region, with the exception of Central America and some countries in South America, are covered now by equal rights. And the necessity of having campaigns and to change hearts and minds is so important in this context. And that is why I mentioned these limitations created by AI somehow. Because if you are targeting people that are undecided, but not totally against, are totally antagonists, it's sometimes very difficult to target them via social media. Either because you have only between your friends or people that follow you, people that are actually convinced of supporting LGBTI rights. And it's very good. You have to talk to them too. You have to convince that it's necessary to act. But it is sometimes much more important and much more present to convince those that are not convinced, but might be convinced. So these are probably very different statements than what you hear of social media in other environments.
Yeah, and I mean, what an absolutely harrowing tale of closing space in Venezuela. And I'm interested, Allie and Jack, you both have researched, you've written, you've spoken exhaustively about the link between human rights and the internet, kind of digital advocacy in our current age. And I'm really curious to get your thoughts. What do you see as the future front lines here? How do we prevent the internet globally from turning into what MP Adrian has described as happening in Venezuela? Maybe put another way, what is the thing that keeps you up at night? And maybe if we want to have a more positive 2020 end, what's the thing that you look forward to for hope?
I'm happy to jump in, and then I'll pass it over to Jack. The thing that keeps me up at night, oh, so many things. Um, I'll focus in on the questions around emerging technologies. So the panel today, we're talking the description around social media and the internet. And we've been trying to answer these questions. How do we protect privacy? How do we protect free expression, freedom of association and assembly on the internet? These questions have been asked for at least 5 years, 10 years. But we're rapidly turning toward the use and just the proliferation of facial recognition, biometric surveillance, 5G generation, 5th generation telecom, all of these new technologies that are going to pose way very new risks to human rights. Also, great opportunities for human development and great opportunities for social justice and social movements. But we haven't been able yet to answer a lot of the questions of social media. So we're not yet ready to answer a lot of these questions of how do we roll back emerging technologies. And I guess this goes into the positive side of it. When we had the Arab Spring and we had a lot of these, about a decade ago, where there was a lot of hope about what the internet could bring for human rights and bring for democracy. And then now we look at it and we're wondering, some of us are wondering, how naive could we have been? At least we're going into the questions of emerging tech in a way where we're already critical of the ways in which they could be manipulated or abused, or even the ways in which even their use is restrictive to human rights, even if they're not being manipulated. So I think there's a lot of really great advocacy globally around pulling back how we use facial recognition, or whether we even want to use it. The fact that we're having that question, we're asking that in the U.S., it's being asked in the EU, it's being asked, in India. Having this global conversation, I think, we're already ahead of where we were 10 years ago. So that does give me hope that, civil society has been working really hard. A lot of these tech platforms have been really, willing to engage with civil society on these questions and with international organizations, that it gives me a lot of hope of, okay, we can actually implement rights respecting regulations. We can protect privacy. It's just going to be a lot of hard work, and it's going to take a lot of time, but we can do it.
I think that my concern, there's so many things that keep me up at night about our movement, but I think my concern is very similar. I'm very concerned about surveillance. And I think the only thing that I would really add that we haven't touched on is, there is kind of this great boogeyman of surveillance by government actors with active malintent, right? Like, I think about the number or sort of the small sub department within the police force in Cairo, Egypt, that is specifically devoted to tracking down LGBTQ people online and arresting them. That obviously is sort of like the big form of surveillance in the room, or that's an example of it. But I have also had very hard conversations with people who I have actually a lot of agreement with about sort of, our politics or our goals for the world, but their solution really was a surveillance solution. So this could be people, I think in our current moment, we hear rumblings and we hear sort of international dialogue about surveillance of people who either have COVID-19 or could have it. I think it comes up also in terms of sort of child protection, that, some people believe that the internet might be a safer place for children if no one could connect to the internet anonymously. And, that it poses a very dangerous that is a very dangerous idea for, I think, all people who are minoritized in their national context, whether that's sort of racial minoritization, religious minoritization. But it also really poses a very unique risk for LGBTQ people because we, unlike, well, I always use myself as an example of this. I'm both gay and Mexican American. In the case of my sort of Mexican identity, there are many, many other members of my family who share that identity. I was never asked to hide that from them. I was born into a family where that was a foundational piece of who we were and what we did together. And that's just not the case, right? For most of us who are LGBTQ, we are born to parents who aren't. And that means that we face a unique challenge in life of just connecting to other people who are like us. And that requires us to be able to connect anonymously if we are to do that safely in most countries in the world where you could be in danger simply for being who you are. So that's what keeps me up at night. The thing that excites me and that sometimes keeps me up at night in a positive way is, and this is a strange example, but I'm very inspired by just the fact that I can go onto the internet and go onto a site like Reddit, which I know has sort of a mixed. There are, I think, many people on the left are very concerned about people on the right who are organizing on Reddit, but there are other parts of Reddit. And I'm very inspired that I can go on there and post something like, I remember hearing a song in 7th grade. I remember only 2 facts about it. I have not been able to find it by Googling it. But because of the scale of the number of people who might be accessing that post or just logging onto that site, they will tell me, they'll be able to find it for me. And when I think about applying that to bigger problems in human life, whether that's sort of, medicinal development or just sharing ideas that can break down barriers of racism or xenophobia, I mean, I think that's very exciting and very inspiring.
Oh, absolutely. That is one of the better aspects of Reddit as well, and it's something I think many tech platforms have to wrestle with. Where are those lines? One way that I think tech, especially here in the U.S., is able to discern that is by the national regulations around it. And one thing that's I think interesting in the trends for the internet is, the kind of internet that you receive really is determined by the country that you're in. China obviously opting for an extremely closed system. Same in Russia. The EU really grounding theirs in GDPR and a more privacy approach, and the US being fairly more open. I'm kind of curious what you all kind of see as the future. I mean, there's a really fine line between a lot of those fears and a lot of really good advancement for making connections, building coalitions, and advancing some aspects of democracy.
I might say something. Not survive trying to fight for democracy in Venezuela without social media. It's the only window we have now left in our fight. And this is why we are so fiercely fighting for it to be the best kind of social media it can be. I mean, to try to detect trolls and bots and all these kind of fake news activities, and denounce them and be able to um, uh, make some kind of a statement when it has been spread around the social media, and take into account these risks that you were mentioning, freedom on the one hand, and the freedom of expression in the other hand. I will always choose freedom of expression, except for the fact that you has to be accountable for who you have, what you have been seeing, particularly in the case of fake news and in the case of any kind of activity that might be considered racist or sexist or homophobic or transphobic or attempt against basic human freedoms. So it's very delicate and very unique new environment we are living in. And of course, it is much more needed. As a matter of fact, we are conducting the dictatorship is conducting pretended to be election this next weekend without political parties, free political parties, and only members of the POV participating, or also parties that were were seized basically via judiciary decisions that pretend to be a part of the opposition. And we are conducting a consultation for all Venezuelans about these elections in order to denounce that they are not free and they are not regular elections. And that will be conducted via internet. That will be conducted via social media. And this is how important it is for us, because this consultation that should be, according to our constitution, mandatory, it's to be conducted via social media. So it's something for us of our essence, of the fact that we are trying to survive and fight against a very fierce dictatorship in a very difficult environment. And we really appreciate the fact that social media, as I said before, is the only window is left to us.
Oh, great. Allie.
Yeah, I was just going to take a stab at your thoughts on where we're moving toward. I think we are heading toward more of a cyber sovereignty type of model of the internet. The internet traditionally was supposed to be this open, global, borderless thing that was going to connect everybody regardless of where they are. And over the past few years, it's sort of been a slow motion splintering of the internet. And now I think over the past year or so, it's kind of like an all-out race toward it. And basically what I mean by cyber sovereignty is just that countries, governments in different countries are sort of erecting their own digital borders in a sign of fraying trust to the open internet. So China's the sort of the big example of it. The Great Firewall. Folks who are living within the country can largely not access information based in other countries. They've centralized their technical infrastructure, which allows just for pervasive monitoring and censorship and filtering of all traffic that is coming from outside the country. Russia and Iran actually have followed this model with different legislation. Iran just last November cut off connections during mass protests to hide really violent responses of protesters. And then over the past year too, it's in Brazil, it's in Turkey, it's in Pakistan, of these movements towards this concept of data localization, which basically forces companies to store their customers' data within a particular geographical area, which then would conceivably allow for police or security agents to have easier access to that data, mainly in countries that there isn't an independent judiciary that is reviewing, warrants for information. And then, over the past few months within the United States, as well as India, the bans on Chinese-owned apps, TikTok and WeChat specifically, and then India's had over 50 different apps banned. That is a move towards cyber sovereignty that traditionally we've not seen from the United States, that I think really undermines the case for an open and borderless internet. And then I think it's also, important to say that the EU has made some moves in this way, and there are cases in which a state-centric model and regulation of the internet can actually be good for human rights. So GDPR is sort of a concept of this, where those protections were put into place to protect people's data, and there's a lot of great stuff in there. for other privacy laws that other countries have been modeling after. But overall, it's a, I think we are moving toward this new reality that there is going to be more state-centric approaches to how the internet is regulated, depending where you live.
I think that's right. I agree with that assessment of the future. I think in some ways it is a welcome development for me. I think that governments sort of correctly can provide some checks and balances on a field that was mostly dominated by companies. And I think that's really important. And I think that the ways that countries will do that will be idiosyncratic and sometimes very destructive. I think one other thing that I would welcome for the countries that would like to provide those checks and balances and still, very much be on the side of creating an internet that is free and vibrant and can allow for these kind of mass collaborations is just to have a bit more cross pollination in the people who are working in the technology sector and then the people working in government. And I'm certain that that's happening. I mean, I know that that's happening, but I think that the pace that we need that to happen at is very fast. And I think that sort of these regulators' ability to do that checking and balancing will be hamstrung if they don't continue to integrate those folks, because the vocabulary and the way that these conversations take place is just not at a very simple level, which is hard but true.
Interesting. I'm going to make a quick plug here. And if anyone viewing or watching at home, if you're interested in these topics, please check out Freedom House's Freedom on the Net report, which was released last month. Has some incredible data behind the trends that we're seeing. And we actually have, the report's author here with us. Allie, I'd love to also kind of probe a little bit further. We're talking about a lot of different trends that are happening globally, but they're all happening in real time. You guys have this great metric that measures opening or closing internets. What are you seeing at kind of a 360, 30,000 foot view?
Yeah. The Freedom on the Net. Thanks for that plug. It's always nice to hear. The Freedom on the Net report, we cover 65 different countries, which it covers about 87% of the world's internet users. And we've been doing, I think I said at the beginning, since 2009. In our most recent report, it showed it was the 10th consecutive year of decline in internet freedom. And we just define internet freedom as the same rights you have offline be protected online. In 2020, this crisis in human rights online was really driven by the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's sort of a point Jack had mentioned earlier with using the phrase public health as justification to censor unwanted information and to increase surveillance of vulnerable populations or journalists or activists. So first, some country information. China has ranked worst of the worst for 6 years in a row. I don't think that's a big surprise. Venezuela is also really far down there with Cuba, Iran, and Vietnam. Iceland ranks the first, with Estonia closely following. And then the US is fourth, tied with Australia and Georgia. And we've, in the US, have had 4 consecutive years of decline in internet freedom as well. And then the big global trends that we saw, the COVID-19 had to do with really state governments, but also companies in many countries are sort of exploiting the opportunities created by the pandemic to manipulate online information and shape their own narratives, to censor critical speech, and to build these new technological systems of social control. So you've probably heard a lot about all these digital contact tracing apps or, telecom or mobile service providers just handing location data over to governments. We saw that that's happening in a majority of our countries, often with just no requirements of oversight, little transparency, really just minimal protections of human rights. Where it's also allowing for a rapid rollout of like facial recognition and airports. So, and in cities like Moscow, for example, deployed their facial recognition system to go after people who they alleged were breaking quarantine. And then also, political leaders sort of use the pandemic as a pretext to censor their unfavorable news, arrest journalists, scapegoat ethnic and religious groups. That happened a lot in India, where the government went after the Muslim population and blamed them for the pandemic, which sort of fit the government's, nationalistic policies right now. And then the final trend we saw, which I spoke about a little bit earlier, has to do with this idea of cyber sovereignty and where we're moving. So it's the report itself is actually over like 500,000 words. So I'll stop there. But yeah, you can learn more at freedomonthenet.org.
Check it out. And I think that also sets us up perfectly. A lot of governments around the world have used the pandemic to further close space. And I think, we've talked a little bit about the different minority populations that are sometimes most acutely affected by this. And I think I'd be absolutely remiss if I didn't say, Jack, MP, Adrian, even Allie, how is this also affecting the LGBTQ communities in some of these closing spaces? We don't have bars or as much outdoor space as we used to have. And now every connection is kind of moving online.
Yeah, one of the things that I've written is actually that in some ways, the sort of American experience of needing to get online to make connections with other folks because we're stuck in our homes mirrors what people experience regardless of the public health situation in certain parts of the world. So, many, many Grindr users who I've talked to in Nigeria describe the same, where there's no space, there's no gay bars, there are no gay sports teams to join. So if you even suspect that you might have a sexual orientation or gender identity that is, not the average, then the only choice that you have is to get online and try to talk to other folks. And as those spaces close, either if you're talking about the pandemic or in the overall sort of trend, it's just very dangerous for all of our folks. And, even as I really, really value people's ability to speak anonymously online, we know that those often do lead to in-person connections. That's obviously amazing and beautiful in many, many situations. And if you're living in Nigeria, the person you're meeting could be a thief who will beat you up and take your money, or in Egypt could be someone who's going to arrest you. So to me, in those places, this is not a new problem. It just feels like our communities are being squeezed further and further down.
Well, I might say on my side just another perspective. It's the fact that if you are very active, you are not out of the closet, which is the rule for many Venezuelans, and you expose yourself in social media by any way that might be used against you in many forms. And much more recently, for instance, a journalist was put in jail because of political reasons, and the former number two of the government, the former vice president, appeared in national TV and show pictures of this journalist not having sex, but having encounters with another guy. And said, you see, this is the kind of guy we put in jail, etc., etc. And it might be for people a risk to be online sometimes openly in the case of Venezuela.
Wow. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Teddy.
Go ahead, Allie.
No, I was just gonna add one more point that we've seen. I think, amid COVID-19, the impact of censorship is even more acute because information can literally mean the difference between life and death. So in a lot of countries where the governments regularly block websites or remove content in relation to like LGBTQ content, I think the impact is just a lot more acute. Like Indonesia, Lebanon just recently unblocked Grindr, but previously Grindr was blocked, and Malaysia government blocked some LGBTQ news outlets as well. So I think everybody just feels that censorship a little bit more tangibly than they might have before, because they could have gotten their information in other ways.
Mm. I'm very struck also by the audience that we have assembled today, and thinking about having a network of LGBTQ leaders like that Victory has very kindly put together today. I'd also be remiss if we didn't take advantage of this opportunity to say, what is it that we as an informed public, or as people that are going to leave this, go check out Freedom on the Net, learn more about these issues, what is it that we can be mindful of in this upcoming year for different policies or objectives, or even things that we can proactively be doing to protect an open internet? And I'll let anyone jump on that first who feels brave.
I was just going to say very briefly that I just really hope that as people are looking at policy and regulation around the internet, that those of us who are LGBT but also do have the privilege to be out, who do have supportive families, and who don't have a problem telling everyone at work our sexual orientation, or everyone who's voting, that we just really remember the needs of those folks who just haven't experienced that privilege and are still living in fear of what would happen if their boss finds out or their family finds out, and making sure that there is a space on the internet for them, and that nothing that we do is going to close that space.
I think that's extremely well put, and raises a lot of the debates right now about, for example, like encryption versus safety, which I sort of reject that dichotomy altogether. But I think there's a number of things we can, civil society and can work with, the private sector and governments to push through different forms of legislation. I mean, privacy laws at the very minimum. The EU is leading the charge with GDPR, but that doesn't regulate government surveillance. It's only involving about companies' use of data. And then the US doesn't have a federal privacy law. So I think that is one of the things we can do immediately. It's obviously very complicated in practice, getting something like that passed. But I think it's going to make a huge difference to have protections that restrict how our data is used and really gives us the agency over our experiences online. And then at individual level, there's a lot of just basic digital security that we should be taking to protect ourselves against, not just, government and public officials, but, either non-state actors or hackers. And this includes like encrypted platforms. It's really important to use those, password managers, and then just basic digital hygiene around, where do you get your information, the sources you're looking for, and how you share information, I think can all help us make an information environment that is more safe, more secure, and more free.
I will just add something relating to the last statement by Allie. I guess that the real challenge is from our side, how to really learn and teach other how to really use internet in this in this 2021 almost, because it's very different than it used to be in 2011 or in 2018. It have changed so rapidly, and I remember that the trainings in social media and internet security that I got in, I don't know, 2016 or 17 are now completely obsolete, and no everybody is aware of that. And I think we have there a huge challenge in order to spread this new information and make social media and internet safer for all us.
Great. Well, I can't believe the discussion time is already lapsed. I feel like we were just getting like all the most interesting issues that are going to plague the 21st century. And also, I think most importantly, positively, how to address them, which is also good. And I think kind of what this year needs. I want to make sure to leave some time, though, as well, to give you all an opportunity to state any final remarks and anything that you'd like to leave our audience with today. We'll go in reverse order from our intro. So, Allie, we'll start with you.
Oh, I'm put on the spot. I feel like I've said all my great lines up. But I think I want to take the opportunity again to thank everybody for having me. This has been really wonderful to have these conversations and build these two new connections. And I just think really that we need to really a lot of the organizations and the companies working on this. I think that if we can really do a lot more innovative responses here and work as a global community, I think that is what's really awesome about the internet freedom community and the tech policy is how we're all interconnected. And I think especially coming from a global north organization, what we can learn from folks around the world. So really building spaces that are inclusive, that we can invite, private sector because they have a huge role to play in protecting rights online. We can invite, governments that, are acting in good faith around this to sort of come up with these answers to these really complex questions and try new things and be very innovative because a lot of these issues aren't going to go away. And I think they're going to get worse as well before they get better. So, I'm heartened by conferences like this that give us the space to have these conversations and brainstorm. And I think it's only through collaboration across sectors and across identities that we're really going to come up with some of the best responses for these issues.
Well, I certainly want to echo, thanks to Victory Institute for having us, and really thank you to everyone who has logged in here, especially who, has recently or not so recently been elected to office. On a very personal note, I've been in the LGBTQ rights movement for about 15 years. And if you had told me 15 years ago that we would have this kind of LGBTQ representation in US elected officials and in so many other countries around the world, I mean, I don't think I even would have believed you. So I think, it matters so much. And thank you so much for taking this on and doing that work. In terms of LGBTQ people on the internet, I think my only final thought is just to say that even as we talk so much about the increased risk for our community, because of homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, and intersecting issues. I think that, my experience running Grindr for Equality for 5 years until August really showed me that we also have some of the most powerful low-hanging fruit for our community because, the community of people who uses Grindr, which is primarily gay and bi cis men, as well as trans people, are in some ways more networked than any other oppressed people on earth. I mean, to have an app like this, going back to my own identities again, there is no Latinx app that so many, such a proportion of the Latinx population is on. There is no indigenous app like this. So our ability to communicate with ourselves is incredible. And I hope that we will all continue to think about innovative ways to take advantage of that.
I also thank you, the Victory Institute, for this opportunity and this very rewarding discussion. I think it was very interesting, and we all learned here from you. And my final remarks will be centered in the fact that a few years ago, we had a statement similar to the US bills, internet we trust. And now we are on the opposite side. In internet, we do not trust. And I will like to have in the few years an attitude from corporations engaged in internet businesses to convince us that the risks of being active in internet it's worth, and the gains we get are better than the risk we take.
Thank you. Well, MP, Adrian, Jack, Allie, thank you so much for sharing all your solutions. I hope next year Victory Institute invites us back, gives us 2 hours so that we can further solve the world's many, many problems. But I really just, again, thank you everyone for joining us and discussing this incredibly important issue and thinking about it from a very substantive lens. So with that, I'll conclude the discussion, and I'd like to invite everybody as well to join the Women Out to Win celebration later this evening. So thank you.